Hey, my name's Inza, welcome back to the channel. Patch 10.2 drops today, so here's everything you need to know that comes in this update. First up, we have the new god for 10.2, and that's Martichoras. So Martichoras is a hunter with unique basic attacks that deal less damage up front per hit, but apply a stacking damage over time to enemies that refreshes in duration with each hit. His passive stacks up over time from hitting basic attacks and abilities and getting kills or assists. At max stacks, he gains an attack speed buff that can be extended by hitting more basic attacks. The stacks are then removed and you must stack it up again to get the buff. Every time this effect goes off, you gain a permanent stack of lifesteal and ability lifesteal up to 30 times. The one is a rolling circle targeter that deals damage to everything in its path and leaves behind a trail of toxins that deals tick damage and slows enemies. The 2 shoots a stinger that passes through minions, damaging them but stopping at the first god hit, dealing damage and leaving the stinger in them for 3 seconds. Hitting that god with a basic attack or ability in those 3 seconds explodes the stinger in an AoE around them, dealing more damage, rooting and reducing healing on the target. If no god is hit, the stinger will instead just remain on the ground for 3 seconds and is explodable in the same way. The 3 places patches of stealth grass that hides you and allies from enemies outside the grass. You are revealed if an enemy steps into the grass or places a ward inside it, plus the normal stealth rules, so basic attacking, using abilities, taking damage, etc. will all reveal you. While in the grass, you gain movement speed and extra basic attack damage, plus more stacks of the damage over time effect on its basic attacks. You can have 3 patches of grass active at once and they last 3 minutes. The ultimate launches you into the sky where you fire down 12 blasts of toxins that each deal damage and shred % protections from the target. Alright, so moving into the skins that are new with this patch, we have Martichoras recolors and masteries. The Goodwill Ishtar skin, which is obtained for not getting banned this year, will be rewarded at the start of next year, so it's not available right now, but it is showcased. As well as skins for Kronos, Tiamat, Artemis, Mulan and Iset from the Magic the Gathering crossover, and 2 normal skins for Jingwei and Kumbhakana. The Mythical Market is a sort of new system, kind of like Danzaburou's store, that offers discounted bundles, but this one is based on what Smite thinks you like, so in theory, these bundles should be more relevant to you than they have been in the past. Moving on to item changes for 10.2, first up, Druid Stone was increased slightly in cost to disincentivize rushing Stone of Binding, while Stone of Binding itself got a nerf to the protection debuff on its passive, mostly in the early game, but this does matter for the entire match. Contagion takes another nerf, 10 damage per tick taken off on the passive, among the other hotfixes that were made to this item already. Prophetic Cloak gets a shift. The cooldown on getting a stack is reduced from 10 to 8 seconds, but the evolved version has 15 less of each protection, so it's less insane when evolved, but still the best tank item in the game when you do complete it, but it's a lot easier to evolve in general now. Sigil of the Old Guard got hammered this update with a reduction to the damage mitigation on the base and per stack, 5% removed in total, as well as the healing per stack on the passive going from 3% to 1%, RIP mitigation builds. Speaking of, Berserker Shield got a similar nerf, halving the damage mitigation while Berserk from 10% to 5%. Crusher has been slightly nerfed with less damage on the passive and a 5 power reduction, but it's also 100 gold cheaper, so not too bad overall. Heartseeker takes a nerf to the base damage on the passive when you have low power. The damage when you have plenty of power is unchanged, so this won't affect jungle builds, it's mostly for solo laners that were buying this in like their 5th or 6th slot. Hornshard's text was fixed to clarify it gives 3 seconds off of cooldowns and not 1.5 seconds. This has always been the case even since the season launch, but the tooltip said otherwise. Kinsides gets a huge buff this patch with 5% more attack speed and 1% extra max health damage on the passive when used against high HP targets. Probably not enough to dethrone crit completely, but it makes more sense now if you want to shred tanks. Speaking of crits, Bladed Boomerang gets a substantial buff. 100 gold cheaper, 5% more base attack speed, and the buff that it drops to you are much closer now so you can pick them up easier in fights. Chronos Pendant gets a 10 power increase, Brawler's Beatstick gets a cost reduction and increase to the base power of the field from 10 to 20, Tier 1 Cloak gets a 50 gold cost reduction so you can get an extra potion and support if you're rushing this as first item. The cost of the actual tier 3 items on the tree hasn't changed though. Cannoneer's Cuirass gets a 150 gold cost reduction, Absolution gets more magical procs and CCR, and finally Phalanx gets more physical procs and health. The god changes this patch were relatively minor for the most part aside from one set of buffs. Aoquan gets a scaling decrease on his 3, Hebo gets a scaling and base damage decrease on his 3, Discordia gets the biggest changes of the patch with 2 seconds off of her 3's cooldown at all ranks. This is bigger than it looks since lowering the cooldown of Discordia's 3 directly lowers the cooldown of her 1 and 2 as well. Plus her ult gets a base damage and power scaling increase, so effectively all 4 of Discordia's active abilities got buffs this patch. Prepare to see more of her. Geb gets a slight damage increase and cooldown decrease on his 2, which should help with his early clear and poke. Tsukuyomi gets a damage increase to his 1 and a scaling increase on his ultimate as well. Jingwei gets more damage on the tick portion of her 1, which will help her wave clear a little bit, and a lower cooldown as you rank this up instead of being flat 12 seconds. And finally, Chernobog gets some mana cost decreases to his 1 and 3, as well as a cooldown decrease on the 3 early on, but it is the same late game, so he's mostly just going to be a bit safer in the laning phase.